Mr. Chairman, I think it's your turn to kick us off again.
Hi, I'm Casey Anderson. I'm the chairman of the planning board. I want to thank Roger. I won't thank everybody else because there's been a lot of thanking going on. And I want to get right into some information and data. We can get the next slide. Somebody ready this slide? Chris? I won't talk too much about transportation, mostly about schools, because I think just looking at the list of folks who've shown up, I think the interest tends to tilt a little bit more to the school side, but we can get a little bit more into transportation later on in the day. I want to make 4 points today. First is that the overall growth rate in the county is actually quite low. We still need to accommodate new residents, but the year-over-year percentage growth rate is flat to very modest. The second one is that the growth rate is inadequate to match the expected number of people we need to fill jobs that are going to be coming open in the next 20 years or so. The third is that the relationship between new development and infrastructure is not quite as tight as most people might think, which makes it difficult to plan, especially for schools. And the last point I want to make is that new development is in fact required to pay for its impact on schools and transportation infrastructure. Next slide. First, the amount and rate of growth. This slide shows the average percentage growth rate per year during each decade since the 1950s. So what you see, I know it's hard to read, the left side of the graph starts in the 1940s and 1950s. The period immediately after the Second World War, we had explosive growth, but off a very small base. We didn't start with very many people, and growth was very rapid in percentage terms during those first couple of decades after the Second World War. Then what you see as we get into the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, is you still have growth in the range of 1 to 3% a year, which is actually a pretty good clip on an annual basis. But more recently, over the last decade or so, we've had growth at or below 1%. And we project off into 2030, 2040, that growth rates are going to slow further to about 0.8 of a percentage point a year to maybe as low as 0.4 of a percentage point a year. So that's not very fast, I think, by any measure. Next slide. Even though the growth rate is low, we're starting with a much higher base. So even a modest percentage increase each year produces a pretty large number of people. So we see that we need about 200,000 more people, figure out how to accommodate 200,000 more people between now and 2040, even at those very low growth rates. Next slide. How is it that we come to these numbers about how many people are going to be coming here? Well, even if new job growth is flat, we're still going to need a lot more people here to take the jobs that people are going to age out of over the next 10 or 20 years. And these numbers are from the George Mason Center for Regional Analysis. They're derived from analysis of demographic factors that don't just include economic growth, but also an analysis of the number of people who right now are my age or 10 or 20 years older than I am, between about 45 and 65, and what's going to happen between now and 2030 as some of the folks in that age group start to retire. Some of them will move to other parts of the country, some of them will pass away, some of them will stay in Montgomery County but move to a different residence, maybe they'll downsize. And so we're going to have, as those people leave their jobs, we're going to have about 129,000 net new workers, even if overall economic growth rates are low and net new job creation is relatively flat. Next slide. The forecast housing demand for net new workers, about 83,000 units between now and 2032. Next slide. This chart shows the 25-year average. That's this blue line. We created about 3,600 new housing units a year each year for the past 25 years. What you see in these bars is the number of units created each year. This is the trough of the recession. In around 2009, we hit a low of about 1,000 units. More recently, we've recovered. 2012, you see we're just above the 25-year average. Now we're right at or maybe slightly above that average. So the point I want to make here is that the amount of new housing development that has occurred, certainly in the last few years, has been quite modest by historical standards. And even though we are slightly above this, the 25-year average now, we're catching up from a very deep trough. We had population growth that was reasonably steady even in the recession because we didn't have people fleeing for other parts of the country, as it happened in some places like Las Vegas, for example, where the real estate market completely collapsed, or cities like Detroit that have struggled to hold on to people. That's good news. We want to be a place where people want to live and work and create businesses. But it means that we have some catching up to do in terms of matching the number of housing units to the number of people and jobs that we have. Next slide. This is the same slide but projected forward. If you see, that's to the left the recent past of how many housing units we've created, and this is the number of housing units we need to create if we're going to hit that 83,000 new units over the next 20 years that I mentioned a couple charts ago. So what you see is we need about 4,200 units a year, give or take, in order to match, just keep up with the natural rate of new workers coming into the county, into the region. And I should also say that this does not assume that we're trying to compete for a disproportionate share of new jobs or workers. This would be a proportionate share of the net new workers that are going to be coming into the greater DC region during that period of time. So it's not as though our economic development strategy assumes that we're going to be taking jobs away from DC or Fairfax or other places. This is just if we got a proportionate share of those new people. Next slide. A lot of people say, well, you know, those charts seem to show that growth has not been very strong, and yet I see with my own two eyes things like this. I see skyscrapers going up with construction cranes, a lot of new development, places like White Flint, Bethesda, Silver Spring, Wheaton, places like that. How is it possible that you're saying growth is flat, very modest, when I see right in front of me that there's all this new development going on? And the answer is, next slide, we see a lot less of this. We see a lot less of the classic greenfield development, large lot subdivisions on the periphery. We see a little bit more urban, more multifamily development, but the total amount of new housing growth that we've had is actually pretty minimal by historic standards over the last few years. Next slide. Okay, next point I wanted to make is the relationship between growth and infrastructure. This slide uses 1990 as the baseline and shows the proportionate growth on the top line of MCPS school enrollment. The bottom line is total population. So what you see is that since 1990, school population has increased much more rapidly than overall population. And in particular, most people think, well, this probably happened during the recession because people found they couldn't afford private schools, so they put their kids in public school. That may be one factor, but what's interesting about that is if you unpack this data, and Bruce can speak to this as well. This is some data I got from Bruce actually about 6 months or a year ago. What it shows is that migration to public school from private school actually started happening about the year 2000. It predates the recession, which would seem to suggest that there's something bigger going on than just a cyclical economic downturn that makes people change their decision about what they can afford or where they want to send their kids to school. Next slide. What are the factors affecting growth in student enrollment? Well, other than new development. One is the move to all-day kindergarten, which happened countywide at about the midpoint of the last decade, about 10 years, a little less than 10 years ago. We have more students moving into public school from private school. Again, that happened starting about the year 2000. It's been pretty steady trend since then. Reduced class size initiatives and move to program capacity measurements of school facility adequacy. That happened in the mid-2000s. So that looks at how many kids are supposed to be in the classroom based on MCPS's program needs, not just theoretically how many kids could be fit in the building. And the last one is demographic transitions and neighborhood turnover. Next slide. Demographic transitions. You saw part earlier that there can be a gap between or a difference between the growth of the school population and the growth of the overall number of people that we have in the county. Some of that is driven over the long term by demographic troughs, baby booms and busts that happen across the country, across the region, but some of it is also localized to individual neighborhoods. This map shows the darker areas are where you have a higher number of people who are over the age of 65. So those are the neighborhoods that in the near future are most likely to experience a lot of turnover, where people who currently are living in a single-family detached house, they've lived in maybe for 40 plus years, they've raised their kids, they've gone to school, the kids have left school, now they're ready to retire and move on, and they're more likely to be selling their house to a young family that's going to have kids in school. So what this causes is a lot of unevenness, there's a lot of lumpiness demographically speaking, in individual neighborhoods, individual school clusters, or even in individual elementary schools in some cases, where you see, at least in the short term, a very rapid increase in the number of kids that are entering school. And that may be very transitory, and Bruce again can speak to this a little bit more than I can, but the issue is that you don't want to spend a lot of money investing in real estate for a school that is then going to be a problem that's moved up to a different school level or may disappear in the next few years. So this happened when I moved to Silver Spring in about 2001. My son was the only kid at the bus stop when he was in kindergarten in 2005. Now my daughter's at the bus stop, and she's 10 years old now, and there's 4 or 5 kids at the bus stop with her. So you can see that there's short-term changes in the age makeup and the point of life of the people in a neighborhood. And I know many of you have probably seen this in your own communities, where you'll suddenly get a rapid increase in the amount of turnover that happens in housing, and that can cause a very severe short-term impact on the schools. But the question for planning and for the school system is what to do about that, how to accommodate that without making a major investment in new schools that may not be needed over the long term, and in fact may come at the expense of investing in schools in other parts of that same community, or maybe in other parts of the county where the need will be more pressing in the near future. So that covers what I wanted to talk about. I will be available all day, so I hope you'll stick around for some of our panels, and I'll be walking around, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions in addition to the ones that we answer in the panel in a few minutes. Thank you.